I would like to get you partly into the shoes of the writer and also partly into the shoes of the reader, which I think we should not forget about. So the issues we're dealing with are not only material, they don't only have to do with wax, parchment, ink, and boards, but also they're also of a cognitive nature. As we all know, I suppose, Jean Malon and others from the mid-20th century suggested we should have a less visual approach of paleography, look less at form, less at letters' shapes, and more as letters as the result of a dynamic process, thus introducing or highlighting the notion of ductus, defined by Malon, as we know, as the number, order, and direction of strokes. The effects of ductus, especially in the context of cursivity, were defined in terms of modifications in single letters or in ligatures between neighboring letters, down to the work of Emanuele Casamassima, who gave us a theory of not only single letters or pairs of letters, but la catena grafica, the whole graphic sequence within whole words or even within whole lines and pages. So the way Malon and his friends and colleagues looked at the history of writing was essentially about deformation through cursivity, but without raising, I think, the issues of legibility, at least not clearly enough, that the issues of legibility that go with these deformations. So the perspective of the reader has been hardly considered in favor of the perspective of the writer. Malon's main point was that even when letter forms look quite different, they might be produced through the same ductus, so the same sequence of strokes, only with fewer pen lifts or with modified proportions, which give us a visually different result. The limitations of that approach, I think there are a few. One is that Malon hardly considered those cases in which letter forms are preserved, but ductus is modified. So the moments when scribes decide that that there could be another more economical way, another more efficient way of producing the same letter form. So in those cases, letter forms are preserved, but ductus is modified, and in the long term, a new ductus tends to lead the letter to evolve in a completely different direction, which might separate it from a similar letter, which had a similar ductus in the first place, and then they sort of move apart as time goes by. That's one point. Another thing is the experimental approaches of earlier paleographers were usually limited to modern tools. So they reflected on the effects of tools on letter forms, essentially in, I would say, geometrical terms, like the effects of a broad nib on the distribution of thick and thin strokes, but usually trying out their theories or getting their theories from experimenting with modern tools, meaning metal nibs, which do not interact with the writing support exactly in the same way as traditional tools, especially goose quills or reed pens. I have done this myself years ago I've experimented with broad nibs to try and understand the evolution of 14th century chancery cursive, and it does work to a certain extent, but within limitations. And later, I worked with calligraphers who, in the French tradition, also tend to work more with metal tools. And I suggested they should try out goose quills, and they were amazed at what they could produce with goose quills that they'd been trying to produce with metal nibs and just couldn't. Goose quill, yeah, gives you much better control and sort of glides over paper or even better parchment, much better than a metal nib, which tends to scrape the paper and stop your movement. Another aspect is, as I said at the beginning, that we have probably not devoted sufficient attention to reading mechanisms. And so back to the visual, not only material aspects, but back to the visual in a different way. Back to the visual after we have learned a lot, especially through recent research in neuroscience, which has taught us much about how we read over the past couple of decades. I would also say that we can benefit from the way typographers look at letter forms. Typographers build letter forms essentially as shapes, though current practice is very much rooted in notions of calligraphy, of writing tools, movements, etc. In the past few decades, that has been very much at the forefront. But just last night, I got a message announcing a lecture in the coming days by a famous typographer entitled Letters as Shapes. So there again, saying letters are not only movements, they're also shapes which you can build out of, you can cut them out from paper and make them in different ways than with a tool and just building strokes. Typographers have much to teach us about the multi-scalar approaches that are possible when looking at writing. We tend to look at letters more than anything. Peter has looked at letters in greater detail. He's looked at serifs and strokes of all sorts. But we usually tend to look at single letters and base our typological assumptions in particular on the various forms of those letters. Whereas typographers have a multi-scalar approach which goes from half a serif to the full page. And their main interest is in the texture of the whole page, the legibility of the page, and the readability of the page, which are two different notions in typography. Legibility is essentially a clear distinction between letters, so you won't confuse a C with an O when reading quickly or in the dark. And readability is a comfortable reading. It's the ability to read for an extended period of time without eye fatigue and with optimal understanding of what you're reading. So it's not just visual; it goes further into the cognitive sphere. And so how we read, to sum up the way it was described some years ago by Stanislas Dehaene, there's probably been lots of specialist literature in the meantime, but it's still, I think, the best sort of introduction to the field of the reading brain, I think is the English title of the book, Les neurones de la lecture in French. The main point he makes, one of his points, is that we do not read single letters, nor do we read whole words as such. And there's been a catastrophic there have been catastrophic teaching methods over the past decades. I think it's over now, known as global reading, teaching kids to recognize the outline of a word without going into the detail of single letters. And what Dehaene shows us is that we have underestimated the potential of the human brain, which does all sorts of things at the same time, recognizes letters, recognizes strokes, first of all, as parts of letters, recognizes letters, digraphs, trigraphs, morphemes, meaning significant parts of words, and whole words, based, among other things, on the frequency of letters, digraphs, trigraphs, words, etc., and of course on context, so on what we understand while we are reading. Well, there are all sorts of interesting conclusions for a paleographer to be drawn from that book. I don't know how many of you have read it, maybe, Peter. No. It's extremely interesting, especially thinking of cursive writing and writing which is potentially more difficult to read. He also goes into that, and so I can only recommend the book to everyone here. And so it's also, I would say, a multi-scalar approach, which shows that the total quantity of information which you can find in any given script is more or less similar. I mean, even in the Chinese script, which we tend to think of as very different from a Latin script, from the Roman alphabet, in It's only the spatial distribution of strokes, which is essentially different. But the quantity of strokes is more or less similar in a Chinese word and in a word in the Roman alphabet. Another thing, yes, which is also very true of Chinese writing and reading, is that reading, at least in expert readers, also takes into account the movements of the pen. Ductus is not only part of writing, it's also part of reading. And that also plays an important role, of course, in the reading of cursive scripts. So I will discuss sort of early Roman writing, essentially first century writing, essentially because that is where Malon, that is the area in which Malon did his work and came up with the importance of ductus. But we could have the same discussion on 13th century cursive or whatever. I would just like to try and go into some details which I think have been overlooked by in the current state of affairs in paleography. So one thing is, oh yes, this is about, I should have shown that earlier. This is about the way Malon described the effects of the pen angle on the distribution of thick and thin strokes, which works with a metal pen, but would also work with a reed pen and so on. Yes, and this as a postscript to my introduction, about the fact that many paleographers do not seem to have any kind of experience in calligraphy at all and have very flimsy notions about the actual effects of the tool. This is taken from a handbook by a great paleographer, Bernard Bischoff. It's an example drawn by himself of the Luxeuil script, which looks absolutely nothing like a Luxeuil script because he doesn't have the right pen. This is done like with a biro, you know. It looks completely wrong because Luxeuil has thick and thin strokes based on a broad nib. Right. And so typology, yes, typology plays an essential, and I would show maybe outsized role in paleography. We need typology, of course, it's part of any science, but how reliable are our typologies? How useful are they? Malon, at the end of his career, becoming more and more radical, wanted to do away with any kind of typology. He thought the only object we can legitimately study is the single artifact, and typology only gets in the way and inhibits our understanding rather than helping it. One thing I think we can say is that our notions of typology are probably too rigid, especially for very early scripts, because they are in large part rooted in our modern reading habits, meaning, among other things, our reading habits acquired in typography specifically, which gives us a pretty rigid notion of what letters look like and how they adhere to a standard. Notions, even very basic notions, such as majuscule versus minuscule, which are classic first chapter paleography, are probably too rigid. When you look at, especially at early cursive scripts, they don't adhere to a proper different definition of majuscule and minuscule, which would be bilinear and quadrilinear, because there's no clear distinction between short and long letters. They tend to dance around. We'll see examples of that later on. Or yet notions of set versus cursive writing. That makes sense maybe in late medieval scripts, but in Roman times, I find that what we do have, I'll be showing that shortly, is more like a continuum of grades of formality, and there's no strict distinction between a formal or set script and a cursive or informal script. Epigraphers especially tend to divide inscriptions into monumental capitals and something called littera actuaria, which is supposed to be closer to actual handwriting with a pen. and which is used especially for reproducing or for publishing public acta. Whereas one essential, I think, aspect of Roman writing is that it is constantly in movement. It's especially from the time of Augustus, there is a sense of movement pervading every single letter in Roman writing, even the most formal. If we move backwards, if you go back to Greek and to pre-first century Roman writing, we find writing that is much more geometrical. This is the geometric spirit of the Greeks applied to writing, both in letter forms and in layout, of course. So in this 4th century Athenian decree, in the Stoichedon style. In early Roman writing, we find letters which are often quite irregular in execution, but there is clearly a geometric concept in the background. And we occasionally find perfectly geometric writing like this one, because in this case it was bronze inlaid in stone, and so it needed to be done very carefully and not just scraped in. And so you have an O, which is a perfect circle, a D, which is half a circle, and so on. Very, very nicely done and very unusual. There are other Italic peoples who are able to do that, but it's quite unusual in the Roman world. From the 1st century, what we find, especially in Pompeii, is the importance of brush writing. We tend to think of the Roman Empire as covered in engraved inscriptions. I suspect there were probably more painted inscriptions than engraved. And so the influence of painted inscriptions, of brush writing on formal inscriptions in stone and marble is certainly one of the reasons why those formal inscriptions themselves show that sense of movement, which is completely missing in Greek epigraphy. This also has to do with scale. The Greek inscriptions are always written small. The monumental inscription in very large capitals is, I believe, a Roman invention. And when I mentioned, yes, grades of formality, that also has to do with scale. The larger the writing is, the more formal it can be, or it will tend to be. But you see on this single wall in Pompeii, the different levels of formality that you have in different inscriptions by different hands, with various treatments of serifs, especially, and I'll be coming back to serifs. This very formal serif, close to what you would find in an engraved inscription, and these thicker serifs, which are more like what you would do with a reed pen on papyrus. In this other inscription from Pompeii, you see also how serifs also express a sense of movement. They're not symmetrical serifs as in typography. You can really follow the movement of the brush moving out of the letter to the left here and to the right there. And just to give you a couple of examples of very formal inscriptions, this is also from Pompeii. It's clear enough here that the movement of the brush is very clearly expressed in the final product. So it was certainly prepared with a brush and then engraved into the stone. And you find a number of inscriptions in stone which are very similar to what we find in brush writing. This is very similar to these here, those very condensed letter forms. And to come back to this, yes, this is of course an image of the famous calendar, the Fasti Prenestini, in which you can see from this close-up the difference between two parts, probably written and engraved, written by the same hand and then engraved by the same person, but in different styles, essentially based on different scales. So this looks very much like brush writing, and the smaller writing looks very much like pen, a reed pen on papyrus, but they're anyway quite close to each other. And so looking at ink writing, what we should also notice at least in the first century, there does not yet seem to be a very clear functional distribution of scripts based on the kinds of texts that are being written. This is a mid first century BC papyrus with verse by Cornelius Gallus in a script that is very similar to what we find a century later in this grammatical treatise, where you also find the same thick, thin contrast as in brush writing, and also a sense of movement with the sloping letters, the way the serifs are treated, and so on. This one is a deed. It's the sale of a house in the late first century. No, sorry, the mid first century. And this, to give you something that's functionally completely different, is a bag of barley with an inscription on the leather here. I believe it's leather here, saying this is barley from this or that place. The writing is absolutely similar to what you find in literary text and documentary text. And as we look at this one, we can start noticing a few details which will lead us to our second part, which is the way in which letters relate to each other within the same script, within the alphabet. There's something that's already visible. Well, no, it's clearer here. Look at the P. The P has a very strong serif. The R has a downstroke that goes below the baseline, prolonging the vertical shaft. This is something that puzzled me for some time, thinking of the evolution of letters in diachronic terms. Why is it that P and R should evolve in different directions? And so that's what we'll be looking at now. Once again, going back to typology, paleographers looking at a table of scripts like this would tend to go, I suspect, downwards and identify, use those different letter forms for the purpose of identifying a type, a script, and then dating it and so on. But they tend to look less at letters in lines and trying to understand how one letter relates to another within the alphabet and what that says about legibility. Among other things, the similarity between similarity of G and T is something which is never mentioned, although it is a very specific feature of late antique and early medieval scripts. And so looking at, again, at papyri from the first century BC and AD, and looking at the evolution of letter forms, we need to deal with the question once again of cursivity. What is cursivity is a very difficult question. There are all sorts of definitions of cursivity. I think one way in which we should not look at cursivity is by labeling single letters as cursive or as minuscule. You need to consider a script as a whole. And in this case, in this first century BC letter, we already find a clear difference between R and P, with R going below baseline and P just stopping at the baseline. This is hardly any serifs, but you can see the difference. Cursivity produces very different results in different materials. You know, these famous wax tablets from Pompeii, in which letters are completely broken up. And in other cases in the first century, you have scripts which, on the contrary, are very much joined up. And so the problem is, how do you identify letters in that kind of script? An expert reader, as de Haan would tell us, focuses on the most distinctive traits, and so would not confuse A and N because he knows the difference lies in this stroke. The difference between P and A would lie essentially in the first stroke, which goes below baseline in A and tends to come back as a hook with a P. So looking at the whole alphabet, Malon would consider the ductus to be pretty much the same in the more formal script and in the more cursive script. But for the reader, the relationship between letters changes completely. And you see D pairing up with B, that works here. But P and R, again, breaking up, going separate ways. And again, I think we can better understand what's happening in cursive writing if we do not consider it as detached from more formal writing. And looking at cursive writing, going back to formal writing, uh, makes us able to notice some differences that we would not have noticed otherwise because we look at these Roman capitals as if they were our own in Times New Roman. And what you notice here is that there's a very different treatment of serifs. Again, this has to do with scale because in this small writing, this is a school exercise from the 1st century, there is no space for the serif at the bottom of R. If you did add a serif here, you would end up with something that looks very much like a B. And that is something that we notice all over the place. As soon as the scale of writing compared with the scale of the writing tool will not allow you to have a big serif on the inside of the R, you might have one on the outside. And that kind of outside serif tends to develop into downstrokes, as we see in cursive writing. And even in later formal scripts like this famous fragment known as the Bellis Macedonicis, we see P and R completely different, and P looking much more like a condensed C actually than an R. This changes the relationship between the letters. In this document from the mid-2nd century, we see probos. You see the P and the R going completely different ways based on different details in the first place and different perceptions of the relationship between the letters. So I could go on with serifs, but I think time is running out. And so maybe I'll leave that at. And just mention in passing the importance of proportions also. With condensed letters, E and F, the size of serifs is such that you can't tell the difference at some point between a serif and a crossbar. And so E and F, I and L and T need to become differentiated in other ways. And that's when you start having taller letters, which we'll find in rustic capitals for centuries, and so on. So how late am I? Pretty late. Yeah, okay. So no questions. Okay. So I'll leave out the last part. Right. Thank you.